How Vikings navigated the sea without the sun or stars. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without maps, compasses, or stars to guide them. Viking sailors navigated some of the most unpredictable waters on Earth, using methods that remain astonishing even today. No instruments, no written charts, just memory, muscle, and a deep understanding of the natural world. How did they do it? What clues did they follow when the sky was overcast, the sea featureless, and the coastline invisible? And why have so few of their secrets been preserved? Let's uncover the forgotten science behind Viking navigation, the techniques, the instincts, and the ancient wisdom that allowed them to reach the edges of the known world and return home. Beyond the fjords, why the Vikings took to open water. The earliest recorded Norse expeditions beyond the Scandinavian coastline began in the late 8th century. In 793 CE, monks at Lindisfarne Monastery on the northeast coast of England described a violent raid by sea-borne warriors. These attackers, later identified as Vikings, struck quickly and vanished before any defense could be mounted. They did not appear from nowhere. They came from coastal settlements in what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, places where arable land was scarce. Fjords cut deeply into the land, and the sea was both boundary and lifeline. The geography of Scandinavia played a central role in shaping Viking seafaring culture. Norway's steep terrain and jagged coastlines made travel by land difficult. Thick forests and uneven ground restricted inland movement, while water offered a more reliable route for connection. Many communities developed near river mouths or deep within fjords, forming a network more easily reached by boat than by foot. Long before the Viking Age, Norse life depended heavily on maritime routes for fishing, travel, and trade. By the time the first raids were recorded, Norse mariners already had centuries of experience at sea. Archaeological finds from the 6th and 7th centuries reveal a high level of shipbuilding skill. At Tun in Astfold, Norway, a burial from the early 800s included a clinker-built ship nearly 20 meters long, strong enough to handle open water. Similar vessels found at Nidum in Denmark and at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway confirm that large, seaworthy ships were in use long before Viking expansion began. But their movement beyond local waters was not just due to technology. One driving factor was the lack of arable land. In Norway in particular, fertile soil was limited, and inheritance customs often split land between sons. As families grew, younger sons frequently received little or no property. For many, acquiring land overseas became a practical path forward. Trade was another strong motivation. At Hiddeby, a major Viking trading hub in southern Jutland, excavations have revealed goods from far-off places, glass beads from the Middle East, silks from Byzantium, and silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate. These items came to Scandinavia through deliberate maritime trade. Norse sailors were not only raiders, they were merchants who engaged with complex international networks spanning Europe and Asia. Political fragmentation at home added another layer. The Norse world of the 8th and 9th centuries was not unified. It consisted of many rival chieftains and small kingdoms. Success abroad could bring wealth and prestige, helping a leader gain influence at home. Raids and trade expeditions became tools for political survival and advancement. Cultural values also supported exploration. Norse mythology, passed down orally and later written in the Eddas, portrayed the sea as a powerful and meaningful space. Njord, the god of seafaring and wind, was honored by sailors. The sea serpent Jarmungandr encircled the earth, making the ocean both boundary and symbol. Legends such as Otter's voyage north to the White Sea and Bjorn Ironside's journey to the Mediterranean framed exploration as an honorable pursuit. By the early 800s, Norse settlers had reached the Faroe Islands. By the late 9th century, they began colonizing Iceland. These were not random discoveries. Archaeological, genetic, and environmental data suggest that Norse sailors had at least a partial understanding of their destination. In 870 CE, Arnason established a homestead near modern Reykjavik, suggesting preparation, skill, and intention. Later sagas, like Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, though written centuries afterward, preserve memories of these early voyages. These accounts describe settlers bringing livestock, tools, and supplies. They returned to fetch families and build permanent communities. These were not castaways, they were pioneers with purpose and direction. Outside observers also noted Norse activity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded Viking fleets overwintering in England by the 850s. Frankish sources described raids reaching deep into inland river systems. In the east, the primary chronicle of Kievan Rus mentioned the Varangians, traders and warriors navigating rivers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Modern reconstructions using replica ships, such as Havingston Frå, Glendalough and Saga Sigla, have demonstrated that Norse sailors could cross long distances without modern instruments, using natural signs like wind, waves, birds, and light. These voyages were not reckless guesses. They were the result of tradition, training, and a worldview where the sea was not to be avoided, but crossed. Built for the sea. How long ship design enabled exploration. The Viking longship was not a sudden invention but a result of centuries of maritime adaptation. Coastal communities across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden refined ship designs to match the realities of the North Atlantic. Boats were part of daily life, not just war. They carried goods, people, and ideas. The longship's shape, structure, and material reflected the demands of a people dependent on the sea. Discoveries like the Gokstad and Oseberg ships, excavated in Norway in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revealed the level of skill involved. The Gokstad ship, dated to around 890 CE, was found in a burial mound near Sandefjord, Norway. Measuring over 23 meters long and nearly 5 meters wide, it combined flexibility with strength. Built using the clinker method, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, the hull flexed with waves instead of resisting them. This design reduced stress on the structure and helped it survive in rough waters. The curved profile allowed the ship to ride high, making it fast, stable, and suited to both sea and shore. The ship's keel was carved from a single curved oak timber, providing strength and aiding in directional control. Viking ships had shallow drafts, allowing travel not just across oceans but also into rivers and fjords. This enabled them to land directly on beaches and escape without needing harbors. Their ability to transition from sea to inland waters made them ideal for exploration, raiding, and migration. A square sail, usually made of wool, was mounted on a central mast. The wool was treated with lanolin or animal fat to repel water. When the wind dropped, crews used oars. The Gokstad ship had 16 oar holes on each side. Oars rested in open rowlocks cut into the hull, which made them easy to remove or adjust quickly. This dual system wind and manpower made the ship versatile in all conditions. Steering relied on a side-mounted oar on the starboard side. Secured with ropes oar, called a estijaren, was shaped from strong wood like ash or oak and operated by the helmsman or styrmar. It allowed precise control, especially in shallow or narrow waters. The combination of the long, narrow hull and this steering method gave the ship exceptional maneuverability. Not all Viking ships were the same. Warships like the Gokstad were long and narrow, built for speed. Cargo ships, called nares, were shorter and broader with deeper hulls, designed to carry up to 24 tons of goods. The Skjoldulv ships, excavated near Roskilde in Denmark and dated to around 1070 CE, included examples of both. These vessels, intentionally sunk to block a channel, were later recovered and studied to understand regional shipbuilding practices. Materials varied by region but followed consistent logic. Oak was the primary choice for hulls due to its durability and resistance to saltwater. Pine, elm, and ash were used for other parts like oars, masts, and internal frames. Trees were felled in winter when sap content was low and then seasoned. To prevent warping, shipbuilders used hand tools, axes, adeuses, and chisels to shape each piece. Tool marks, still visible on preserved ships, reveal technique and craftsmanship. Building a longship required thousands of hours. Estimates for the Gokstad ship range from 4,000 to 5,000 man-hours. That includes shaping wood, forging rivets, weaving sails, and assembling the vessel. No blueprints were used. Shipwrights learned through apprenticeship, memorization, and hands-on work. The knowledge passed through generations, held in minds and hands, rather than written plans. Decoration was not uncommon. Prows often featured carved animal heads, dragons, serpents, or birds, which may have served protective, symbolic, or roles. The Oseberg ship, used in the burial of 2 elite women around 820 CE, was richly adorned with spiral motifs, interlace patterns, and carved details. This ornamentation reflected both belief and identity. Shipbuilding was not limited to Norway. Similar techniques were used across the Norse world, from Sweden to Denmark to Iceland. Though regional variations existed, the clinker hull, shallow keel, and steering oar were common to all. This consistency helped ships be understood and repaired far from home. Modern replicas like the Hemkomstand, Drakon, Harald Herfager, have successfully crossed the North Atlantic using only traditional methods. These voyages prove that Viking ships could manage storms, navigate by natural signs, and reach distant shores without modern instruments. The Viking longship was a product of practical experience, built for a world where land was scarce and the sea was the only road. Soundings and shorelines, navigating by coastal cues. The rugged western coastline of Norway, marked by fjords, rocky inlets, and narrow channels, served as the training ground for early Viking navigation. Long before open ocean voyages began, Norse sailors traveled along established coastal routes, relying on the landscape itself. In the 8th and 9th centuries, navigation was observational. There were no maps or instruments. Crews guided their ships by memory, watching the shape of valleys, cliffs, and the orientation of islands. This knowledge was passed down orally and refined over generations. Sites like Borg in Lofoten and Kopang in Vestfold, both active by the late 700s, offer archaeological evidence of early maritime trade. Excavations at these settlements have revealed Frankish glass, Arabic, silver, and Baltic amber. These goods arrived via sea routes well before the first recorded Viking raid at Lindisfarne in 793 CE. The crews responsible for these early journeys followed coastlines with accuracy, using landmark recognition to safely navigate long distances. By the 9th century, sailors used prominent features such as Sukkertoppen near Lezand and the Twin Hills, Leidehorn and Dam Stidsvilleet near Bergen as visual markers. These landmarks could be seen from offshore and served as guideposts. Navigators memorized routes in spoken verse or oral lists. In poor visibility, sound replaced sight. Sailors learned to judge distance from land by listening to seabirds, crashing waves, or the change in wind echo. These skills were developed through daily practice, not instruments. The Grunlandinga saga, compiled in the 13th century, records stories of sailors hearing land before seeing it. Although no sounding lines from the Viking Age survive, indirect evidence supports their use. Later Norse sources mention weighted lines marked with knots or leather strips, used to measure water depth or retrieve seabed samples. Mud, gravel, or shell fragments could help identify specific anchorages. These techniques likely existed in Viking seafaring, even if no physical examples remain. At Hideby, a major Danish trading hub, active from 770 to 1020 CE, harbor surveys reveal narrow, shallow channels. Long piers and sediment-heavy waters would have required careful entry. Mariners likely relied on depth cues, tactile feedback, and sediment recognition. Approaching without precise local knowledge risked grounding or damage, reinforcing the idea that early Norse sailors used more than just sight to reach port. In the Skagerrak Strait between southern Norway and northern Jutland, navigation became more complex. Shifting currents, sandbanks, and tides created a hazardous environment. Experienced helmsmen timed crossings with favorable conditions. Around 1070 CE, ships were sunk deliberately at the Skuldelov barrier to block access to Roskilde Fjord. This act illustrates the importance of strategic waterways and the depth of local navigational knowledge held by those defending them to the east. The coastline posed different challenges. From Gotland to Bøker, lower shores and scattered skerries made navigation less about distant peaks and more about reading water movement and island placement. Bøker, located on Lake Mälaren and active between 750 and 975 CE, was accessible only through narrow channels that changed with the seasons. Sailors had to know which paths worked during spring floods and which became too shallow by autumn. When Norse voyages extended to the Faroes and Iceland, beginning in the early 9th century, they brought these coastal techniques with them. Land wasn't approached blindly. Sailors memorized the profile of cliffs and mountains. Mount Estja, towering above Faxafløy Bay near modern Reykjavik, became a known point for arriving settlers. According to Landnamo Bach, Ingolfur Arnason recognized the area visually, even in unfamiliar regions. Viking navigation remained rooted in reading the landscape. Oral sailing instructions often contained exact details. A helmsman might be told, turn west after the third headland once the flat hill appears on the port side, with no compass available in Europe until later centuries. These mental instructions formed the basis of seafaring. Sagas frequently describe movements in terms of what could be seen. They passed the cliffs, or they sailed where the coastline bent. These were not poetic flourishes, they were navigational directions. In 845 CE, Ragnar Lothbrok led a fleet up the Seine River using these same principles. They followed islands, bends, and bridges. The Annales Bertiniani record the shock of Frankish defenders who underestimated the Vikings' inland mobility. By the 10th century, Norse helmsmen maintained extensive mental maps. These unwritten routes connected places like Hiddeby, York, Dublin, and Gotland into one navigable network spanning the North Sea and Baltic. Waves as a map, reading swells, currents, and tides. Viking sailors used the sea itself as a navigation tool. Without charts, compasses, or modern instruments, they relied on environmental patterns such as swells, currents, and tides to understand direction and distance. These natural indicators provided a framework for orientation, especially during long-distance travel. Swells were one of the most reliable indicators at sea. They are long, rolling waves formed by distant weather systems. Unlike short, choppy waves caused by local wind, swells move steadily and in a consistent direction. For Viking navigators, the angle and rhythm of a swell helped identify open sea conditions or proximity to land. A swell coming from the west might suggest an approach toward the Atlantic Ocean, while one from the east could indicate a return to the Scandinavian coast. These patterns were familiar to experienced helmsmen. The way a ship moved in response. Two waves could signal whether it was aligned with the swell or drifting off course. If the hull began to tilt or move in an unexpected rhythm, it might mean the ship had veered from its planned heading. The helmsman adjusted the ship's position using these cues, maintaining direction without needing visual landmarks. Currents also played a role. In areas like the Skagerrak and Kattegat to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, currents shift due to wind and tidal effects. These movements could carry a ship sideways or make it harder to steer. Viking sailors had no written records of current behavior, but later texts like Konang Skugstja, written in Norway around 1250 CE, describe how tides and currents changed daily and how experienced sailors timed their movements accordingly. On a voyage from Hiddeby to Aarhus, for example, a crew would need to understand how water moved at specific points. Helmsmen looked for small signs, the resistance of the rudder, the motion of debris in the water, or the feel of the current against the hull. These signals helped crews make real-time decisions, adjusting sail position or rowing technique to stay on course. Tidal knowledge was essential, especially along the British Isles, where Vikings began raiding and settling in the 9th and 10th centuries. Areas like the Bristol Channel experienced one of the highest tidal ranges in the world. If a ship arrived too early or too late, it risked being grounded or pulled away from shore. Viking ports such as Dublin and York required careful planning for entry and exit based on tidal timing. Changes in wave patterns could also reveal the presence of nearby land. Swells that hit islands or coastlines bounced back and created interference patterns. On the sheltered side of an island, the sea might look unusually calm. These differences were useful when visibility was poor. A crew sailing toward Iceland might first notice the way waves changed before seeing Mount Estja rise near the shore. This method helped sailors identify land long before it appeared visually. Other maritime cultures, such as those in Polynesia and Micronesia, used similar techniques, though they operated in different regions. The principle was the same: recognize how waves behave around land to detect islands before they can be seen. Viking sailors developed these methods through repetition, building knowledge from one voyage to the next. In areas like the Pentland Firth or south of the Shetland Islands, wave patterns became more hazardous. Where wind met opposing currents, short and steep waves called overfalls formed and created dangerous sailing conditions. Viking helmsmen learned to avoid wartime crossings in these places carefully. A miscalculation could expose the ship to unstable water, risking damage or delay. Even in open sea, changes in wave angle or motion were meaningful. If a ship expected a swell from the west but felt waves begin to hit from the southwest, it might suggest current drift or weather changes. Adjustments were made without discussion. A helmsman might change course slightly or direct rowers to compensate for the shift. This type of real-time correction was based on routine rather than formal. Measurement. Viking navigation depended on interpreting the sea's behavior. Swells helped establish orientation, currents indicated drift, and tides controlled when a ship could approach or leave a harbor, together with visual cues along coastlines and knowledge passed down through oral tradition. These methods allowed Norse sailors to cross wide distances with consistency. They did not rely on guesswork. Instead, they responded to recognizable, natural patterns to guide their movement through unfamiliar water. Sailing with the wind, the practical aeronautics of Viking voyages. Viking longships are remembered for their speed and shallow design, but their effectiveness at sea relied heavily on wind-powered travel. While rowing was useful for rivers and short maneuvers, it was the sail that enabled longer voyages. Viking crews had to understand how wind worked and how to manage their sails constantly during a journey. The standard Viking sail was square and made of wool. It was hung from a single mast and supported by a wooden yard and ropes. These sails were large, often between 70 and 90 square meters, depending on ship size. Because wool is not airtight, the fabric had to be treated with oils or fats. Animal fat, fish oil, or lanolin made the sail more resistant to water and better at catching wind. The cloth was tightly woven, sometimes dyed red or brown using pigments like iron oxide or madder root. These colors also helped preserve the fabric from sun and salt damage. Sailing with a square sail had limits. Viking ships could not sail directly into the wind. Instead, they used a method called tacking, zigzagging at an angle to make progress against the wind. Reconstructions, such as the Sea Stallion of Glendalough, a replica of a 10th century log, show that Viking ships could sail 45 to 60 degrees off the wind. This required stable wind and careful steering. Travel plans had to consider wind direction in advance, especially when crossing open seas where turning back was difficult. The sail's position had to be adjusted throughout a voyage. The yard could be raised or lowered, and ropes called sheets controlled the angle and shape of the sail. When the wind shifted, the crew adjusted the ropes to maintain proper tension. Poor adjustment could slow the ship or even make it stall. Too much wind at the wrong angle could push the vessel off course or tilt it dangerously. Handling the sail was a shared task, requiring coordination and timing. In the North Atlantic, summer winds usually blew from the west. This helped ships returning to Scandinavia but made outbound trips harder to sail westward toward Britain, Ireland, or Iceland. Mariners timed their departures to catch short windows of favorable weather. The sailing season ran from late spring to early fall. Winter sailing was avoided due to storms and unpredictable wind. Sail handling took teamwork. Raising or lowering the mast's yard required several men. In calm conditions, the mast could be lowered and tied down while the ship was rowed. The helmsman at the back of the ship used a side-mounted steering oar to keep the ship pointed in the right direction. Quick adjustments to the sail were often needed during wind shifts or sudden gusts. Runnerstones and ship burials show that crews were trained and experienced in these tasks. Sailing greatly increased travel range. A ship with favorable wind could cover 100 to 180 kilometers in one day. The distance from Norway to Shetland, around 300 kilometers, could be done in 2 or 3 days. Sailing to Iceland, a journey of nearly 970 kilometers, could take less than a week in good conditions. These trips would not have been possible using only oars, especially with cargo or livestock on board. Historical texts reflect the importance of wind. The Íslendingabók, written in the early 1100s, mentioned settlers reaching Iceland after catching favorable summer winds. The Landnámabók records similar stories. Many sagas mention wind delays or crews waiting in port for better weather. These details show that Viking sailors understood wind patterns well and relied on them when planning. Modern reconstructions have tested Viking sailing. The Saga Sigla, launched in the 1980s, circled the globe using square sails and traditional rigging. Though slower than modern boats, it demonstrated that Viking-style ships could complete long voyages with careful wind management. The crew used similar methods to those described in sagas and archaeological records, adjusting sail position, reading wind, and maintaining course through practice and communication. Wind was not just a background force, it shaped Viking routes, timing, and success. While they had no tools to measure it, Viking sailors developed practical skills by observing and adapting. Their understanding of wind came from trial, memory, and repetition, combined with navigation by landmarks, waves, and stars. Wind became part of the system that carried the Norse across the North Sea to the British Isles and as far west as Greenland. Listening to the sea, how acoustic clues guided mariners. Before sonar or modern instruments, Viking sailors relied on their senses, including sound, to guide their ships. In conditions where sight was limited, such as fog, darkness, or unfamiliar coast's auditory cues became essential. Vikings listened to the pitch and rhythm of waves, the way surf broke against cliffs or beaches, and the calls of birds. These clues helped them detect nearby hazards, confirm their location, and anticipate land before it became visible. In northern waters like those around Norway and Iceland, fog was frequent, especially in spring and early summer. These thick sea fogs could persist for days, making navigation by sight nearly impossible. Mariners trained themselves to detect changes in water, sound, and rhythm. For example, a sharper, louder crash might suggest waves hitting a rocky cliff, while a softer break indicated a sandy shoreline. These subtle differences helped sailors steer clear of danger and understand their surroundings even when they could not see them. The Grönlandinga saga, compiled in the 13th century, contains a reference to this practice. It notes that sailors heard land before they saw it, describing how the sound of surf warned them of Greenland's coast. Though sagas blend fact and fiction, this detail likely reflects real navigational techniques. In darkness or poor visibility, the noise of breaking waves could be a critical warning, allowing a crew to adjust course in time. Near rocky shores like western Norway or eastern Iceland, sound carried useful detail. Echoes created by waves striking cliffs could suggest proximity to land, while the absence of echoes might indicate open water. Even the gentle swirl of water around a submerged rock could be recognized by experienced sailors. Bird sounds also played a key role. Seabirds, such as puffins and gulls, nest along cliffs, and their presence, especially in clusters of fin, signaled nearby land. Silence, too, carried meaning. The sudden absence of birds could mean the ship had moved beyond their nesting range or into deeper waters. The connection between birds and navigation is well documented. According to the Landimabok, a Sharath, century Icelandic text, Floki Vilgaharson used ravens to find Iceland in the 860s. He released 3 birds. One flew back to the Faroes, one circled and returned to the ship, and one flew northwest and did not return. Floki followed the last bird and eventually reached land. While this is primarily a story of visual navigation, it illustrates the Vikings' awareness of avian behavior, including flight and sound patterns. Some crew members likely specialized in interpreting these acoustic signs. Although there was no official title for this role, such knowledge would have been valuable. Novices learned by listening and observation. They were trained to detect small changes, how the sea should sound in specific areas, and what it meant when it sounded different. This listening skill was part of the broader seafaring knowledge passed from one generation to the next. In shallow or unknown waters, sound also helped assess depth. Though weighted ropes sounding lines were likely in use, skilled mariners could recognize depth changes by listening. A subtle shift in how waves hit the hull or the scraping of the keel on gravel warned that the ship was approaching shallows. In tidal zones, exposed rocks made different sounds as water levels changed. Navigators often timed their movements by how the coastline sounded at different stages of the tide. Fjords presented unique challenges, and echo played a special role. Sound bouncing off rock walls revealed the shape and openness of narrow channels. A returning echo indicated a cliff or wall, while no echo suggested a cove or inlet. At night or in fog, such echoes became valuable tools. Crews slowed down and relied on auditory cues, adjusting their course based on changes in water tone, bird calls, and echo behavior. These techniques were rarely written down. Instead, they were passed orally and reinforced through practice. Over time, this ability to read the sea by sound became part of the culture of Norse seamanship, whether sailing across the North Sea or approaching the ice-covered shores of Greenland. Viking crews depended on this skill to navigate safely. Today, such methods are largely forgotten, replaced by modern technology. But for Viking sailors in open wooden ships, silence was an asset. With no engines to drown out the sea, they heard everything, and what they heard often kept them alive. The use of sea foam, bird flight, and whale paths in open water. Viking mariners relied on layered environmental signs to guide their long-distance journeys, especially when traveling beyond the view of land. In the absence of compasses or maps, they observed changes in the sea's surface, the movements of birds, and even the behavior of marine animals. These cues helped them identify directions, currents, and potential landfalls in the open ocean. Seafoam was one of the earliest indicators used at sea. It forms when wind and wave action trap air, mixing it with organic matter at the surface. Viking helmsmen studied its movement closely. In shallow waters or near reefs, foam gathered in patterns or clumped along tidal boundaries. These formations often marked submerged dangers. Where foam lines curved or split, it could signal the meeting of currents. Places where land might be near or tidal changes created turbulence. Sailors became familiar with the typical foam behavior in the areas they frequently crossed and recognized. When something seemed different, around Iceland and the Faroe Islands, seafoam patterns were especially important. In the waters off the Reykjanes Peninsula, foam often collected above rocky shelves, even during calm conditions. Viking ships approaching this area could interpret these signs as warnings of underwater terrain. Similar clues helped crews sailing from Norway to Greenland during the 10th century, such as the expeditions of Eric the Red. By watching foam behavior, they avoided hidden obstacles and found safer paths through new waters. Bird behavior also provided navigational information. Seabirds tend to follow regular paths based on feeding or nesting. Some, like puffins or fulmars, rarely travel more than 50 to 80 kilometers from land during breeding seasons. When sailors noticed birds flying in groups or moving steadily in one direction, it often meant land was close. Birds flying away from the ship might be returning to a nesting site, giving the crew a possible direction to follow. Increased bird activity or noise was another indicator that land might be nearby. This approach appears in historical texts. The Land Nóbak, a 12th century Icelandic settlement record, describes how Floki Vilgaharson released ravens while searching for Iceland in the 860s. One bird flew back toward the Faroes, another returned to the ship, and the third continued northwest and did not return. Floki followed that direction and eventually reached land. Although this example highlights visual observation, the method aligns with known bird behavior and likely included auditory awareness as well. Bird sightings were particularly reassuring during the longest crossings. The journey from Iceland to Greenland, a distance of about 1,200 kilometers, was mostly without landmarks. Crews would watch for species like great skuas or northern fulmars. These birds might trail ships while scavenging but changed behavior near shore, especially at dawn or dusk. Trained observers would note these shifts and relay information to the helmsman. In addition to birds and foam, some Viking sailors may have used marine animals, especially whales, as part of their navigational awareness. Large whale species, such as humpbacks or North Atlantic right whales, followed seasonal routes. These often ran along continental shelves or near underwater ridges. By observing the direction in which whales surfaced or traveled, sailors could infer the position of feeding grounds or shallow areas, and potentially the direction of the nearest coastline. Whale sightings were common in Norse territories. The Islending buck and other early Icelandic texts mention whales near settlements or during sea journeys. These accounts, while not navigational instructions, suggest that such animals were closely watched and understood. In Greenland, Norse communities in the Western settlement developed practices related to whale hunting, likely reinforcing their knowledge of whale behavior over time. Comparable traditions existed in other seafaring cultures. Polynesian sailors in the Pacific, for example, used whale movements to detect nearby islands. Although Viking sources do not record the same techniques in detail, it is likely that similar habits formed independently. Observing a pod of whales, moving consistently in one direction or surfacing repeatedly along a certain path may have served as another subtle guide. Each method, birds and whales, provided only partial information, but when combined with wind, wave direction, and personal experience, they formed a practical system. Viking sailors learned to read these signs over years at sea. developing skills that were passed from mentor to apprentice, not through books, but through lived practice. Navigation in the Viking Age relied on continuous awareness, repeated observation, and a deep familiarity with the natural world. Daylight without the sun, the polar sky and ambient direction finding. Navigating by daylight might seem simple, but for Viking sailors in northern waters, the sun was not always a reliable guide. In the summer, especially near the Arctic Circle, the sun could remain low for long hours or never set, creating continuous daylight without clear direction. Around the summer solstice, the sun often circled the horizon instead of rising or setting, making east and west difficult to determine. Overcast skies added another challenge by hiding the sun entirely. To deal with this, Viking mariners learned to interpret subtle sky patterns, including gradients of light, changes in cloud cover, and color shifts on the horizon. Although no Viking-era manuals survive, evidence from oral traditions, modern reconstructions, and comparisons with other northern sailing cultures suggests that Viking sailors used consistent methods of ambient direction finding. In these polar regions, the sun traveled across the sky at a low angle, which caused long shadows and gradual color changes. These shifts, when carefully observed, gave mariners enough information to maintain a general sense of direction. One important method involved the brightness gradient across the sky. Even under thick cloud cover, the area closest to the hidden sun usually appeared slightly brighter. Experienced sailors could detect this difference and estimate the sun's location with reasonable accuracy. Experimental archaeology suggests that the human eye can identify the sun's position within about 5 to 10 degrees using this gradient. While not exact, this level of accuracy was often good, enough to keep a ship on course during long voyages. Cloud behavior also provided useful information. High-altitude clouds such as cirrus often reflected sunlight even when the sun was blocked. The location of the brightest part of the cloud cover indicated the sun's direction. The undersides of lower clouds also varied in brightness, especially during early morning or late evening, offering additional clues about orientation. Twilight patterns in the far north were another tool. A band of light, often called the twilight arc, remained visible along the horizon for hours when the sun dipped just below it. This band appeared in the northeast in the morning and the northwest in the evening. By tracking the location and movement of this arc, mariners could judge whether they were heading north, south, or deviating from their planned path. These changes were gradual, but over time, experienced sailors learned to read them effectively. Even the sea's surface helped. On calm days, the water reflected the sky's brightness. Sailors could look down as well as up to confirm where the sun was. Horizon color also varied slightly depending on direction. Early morning skies to the east often had a bluish tint, while evening skies to the west appeared warmer or more golden. These cues were subtle but valuable when no other landmarks were available. This kind of observation was not learned from texts but from experience. New sailors learned from older crew members who pointed out changes in sky or light and explained how they related to navigation. Over time, these visual cues became second nature. Mariners did not need instruments because they had trained themselves to notice the small but consistent patterns that guided them. Some researchers believe Viking navigators may have used sunstones, naturally occurring crystals, such as Iceland spar, to locate the sun's position. Iceland spar can polarize light and reveal the sun's direction even when it is hidden by clouds. When rotated in the open air, it shows a visual effect that appears at a fixed angle to the sun. Although direct evidence of Viking use of sunstones is limited, the material existed in the region, and the technique was effective under the conditions Vikings often faced. If used, sunstones would have added a layer of confidence to what the eye already suggested. The success of Viking voyages between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and beyond shows that their methods worked. Even without compasses, charts, or modern instruments, they were able to return to the same destinations repeatedly. Their ability to read the sky, whether clear or overcast, during daylight or twilight, was an essential part of that success. By watching the movement of light and learning how it interacted with clouds, sea, and sky, Viking sailors developed a practical system of direction finding. It was not based on guesswork, but on repeated observation and memory, passed down from sailor to sailor through generations. The sunstone debate, optical crystals and cloudy sky navigation, One of the more debated theories in Viking navigation is the possible use of a sunstone to locate the sun when it was hidden by clouds or fog. This idea stems from LFSTTR, a 13th century Icelandic tale in which King Olaf II uses a stone to find the sun's position during overcast weather. In the story, the king lifts the stone, rotates it, and observes where the light appears strongest. Though the account is framed as religious literature, its specific description of how the stone works has led researchers to consider whether it reflects a real navigational technique. The mineral believed to match this description is Iceland spar, a transparent form of calcite found in Iceland and other northern regions. Iceland spar is known for its optical properties, especially double refraction and polarization filtering. When light passes through it, the crystal can split it into two, raise and highlight the angle of polarized light in the sky. That angle changes depending on where the sun is, even when it's obscured by clouds. Trained users can sometimes see a faint shape called Headinger's brusher pattern that appears perpendicular to the sun's position. Though subtle, it can be used to estimate where the sun is in the sky. In 1967, Danish archaeologist Thorkild Ramskog proposed that Viking navigators may have used such crystals at sea. He argued that the reference in LFSTTR likely pointed to Iceland's spar, and that the mineral's availability in Viking lands made it a practical tool. Later, researchers at ETV's Lorand University tested the theory. Their 2011 study showed that a person with basic training could use Iceland's spar to find the sun's location within about 1 to 5 degrees. This level of accuracy was enough to maintain a consistent heading across long distances. Still, the theory has limits. No confirmed sunstones have been found in Viking archaeological contexts, while Iceland's spar has turned up in some later shipwrecks, including one from the 16th century. There's no evidence tying it directly to Viking use. The lack of artifacts raises questions. If sunstones were a standard part of navigation, why haven't more examples been discovered in graves, toolkits, or settlements? Supporters of the theory note that Viking navigation often relied on knowledge passed orally, rather than stored in tools. The sunstone, if it was used, may have been one tool among many, and not necessary for all voyages. A single navigator aboard a ship might have carried one, using it only in specific conditions, such as heavy fog or dense cloud cover. Most of the time, Norse sailors relied on their understanding of waves, birds, wind, and sky color. The story of King Olaf using a sunstone is sometimes seen as symbolic rather than practical. The narrative places the event in a religious context, possibly exaggerating the act. However, the technical detail of how the stone is rotated and used to locate light does match what we now know about polarized light. Some researchers believe this suggests the story preserves real knowledge that had become mythologized over time. Replica voyagers using Viking-style ships have tested the concept in real conditions. Some crews brought Iceland spar on board and attempted to use it during overcast weather. In many cases, they were able to detect light polarization and estimate the sun's location. These experiments suggest that sunstones were usable but not essential. They added a level of confirmation to what seasoned sailors could already determine through observation. Other seafaring cultures also used indirect cues for orientation. Inuit travelers tracked light in whiteout snow conditions. Pacific navigators used sky reflections and bird flight. In that context, the possible Viking use of a sunstone fits within a broader global pattern of environmental navigation without instruments, whether sunstones were widely used or not. The theory highlights how Norse sailors were attentive to small details. Their approach to navigation depended on recognizing consistent patterns in nature. A sunstone would have complemented this skill set, offering one more tool when usual cues were blocked by weather. The lack of physical evidence leaves the question open, but the method itself remains scientifically sound. If Viking navigators used sunstones, it would have reflected their broader strategy: observe, adapt, and find direction using what the natural world offered even when the sun could not be seen. Night voyages and darkness, how the Vikings traveled without stars. Night sailing during the Viking Age presented several challenges, particularly when stars were not visible. While other seafaring cultures developed celestial navigation, there is limited evidence that the Vikings used stars in a consistent way. Polaris, the North Star, was technically visible from Scandinavia. but its low position on the horizon and frequent cloud cover in the North Atlantic made it an unreliable tool. There are no surviving Viking star charts or written accounts that suggest constellations played a major role in their navigation system. Polaris could sometimes offer a general sense of direction, especially in calm, clear weather. However, most Viking sea travel occurred in the summer, when daylight lasted nearly all night at high latitudes. In these conditions, even when stars were technically above the horizon, they were difficult to distinguish. In addition, no saga or navigational text from the Viking period describes constellations being used to chart a course, as is found in Mediterranean or Islamic traditions of the same era. Instead, Viking navigation at night relied more heavily on environmental awareness, physical feedback from the ship, and oral transmission of knowledge. The helmsman, or styrmar, maintained the ship's heading using tactile and auditory cues. The pressure of the wind on the sail, the feel of the steering oar, and the sound of water hitting the hull all contributed to the helmsman's sense of direction. This method allowed a skilled sailor to detect small changes in the ship's alignment, without needing to see stars or the horizon. Archaeological evidence supports the importance of the helmsman's role. The Oseberg ship, dated to about 834 CE and excavated in Norway, includes a large steering oar mounted on the starboard side. This design allowed for fine manual adjustments. A similar system appears in the Gokstad ship, which dates to the late 9th century. These ships were not steered automatically or mechanically. They required active attention, especially in poor visibility. At night, rowing also played a practical role in maintaining course and rhythm. Crews rowed in shifts, and rowing strokes could serve as a basic measure of time or distance. When visual references disappeared, the sound and rhythm of rowing created a consistent framework for orientation. These methods appear in later Scandinavian texts that describe maritime labor, and they are consistent with similar practices in other pre-modern seafaring cultures. There is evidence that Viking crews used simple onboard lighting. Oil lamps made of iron or clay have been found in Viking-era sites such as Hiddeby, which was an important trading center from the 8th to 11th centuries. These lamps provided limited light, likely used for essential tasks on board. There is no indication that lamps were used as navigational tools, although some scholars have suggested that a stern-mounted lamp might provide a visual reference on the sea surface under specific conditions. This theory remains speculative. In familiar coastal regions, Viking sailors could use land features to guide them, even at night. Sharp mountain silhouettes, cliffs, or fjords might be visible under moonlight or during twilight. Western Norway, in particular, with its steep coastal geography, offered landmarks even in low light. Additionally, experienced crews could identify shoreline characteristics through sound. The noise of waves breaking on rock versus sand provided clues about distance from land or the type of coast ahead. Night sailing is referenced occasionally in saga literature. The Saga of Harald Hardrada, compiled in the 13th century, recounts how a fleet moved through a fjord under darkness. Although partly fictionalized, the story reflects a knowledge of nighttime operations and the ability to travel under limited visibility. Norse ships were capable of such journeys and likely did so when strategic or practical needs required it. Voyages between Iceland and Norway spanned roughly 1,000 kilometers and could last 5 to 7 days. Stopping each night was not realistic. The Landamobok, compiled in the 12th century, records several such crossings, often noting the time of year and direction of travel. These records are not navigational manuals, but they suggest that Viking crews were capable of heading over multiple nights without depending on celestial navigation. In Viking seamanship, darkness did not stop movement. It simply required different tools based on physical awareness, memory, and shared experience. Their system of night navigation was not based on the stars, but on attention to the ship itself and the world immediately around it. The feel of the helm, muscle memory, and sensory orientation. Viking ship navigation often depended more on physical sensation than on sight or instruments. In situations with low visibilities such as fog, darkness, or the open ocean, helmsmen maintained course by using the feel of the ship. The steering oar, located on the starboard side, created a direct connection between the helmsman's body and the ship's response to the sea. Subtle shifts in wave pressure, wind direction, or current could be detected through changes in tension. This allowed the helmsman to make real-time adjustments without needing visual references. Evidence from archaeological finds shows how this worked in practice. The Gokstad ship, buried around 890 CE in Sandefjord, Norway, had a large steering oar fastened at the stern. Its design included a vertical tiller post, giving the helmsman leverage and control. The Oseberg ship, dated to about 820 CE and discovered in 1904, had a nearly identical setup. Both ships placed the helmsman in a standing position at the rear, where he could control the tiller while observing the sail and water. These similar configurations suggest a common approach to steering among Viking seafarers. The helmsman could feel when the ship was turning off course or when a gust shifted the sail. The feedback came through the tiller, allowing adjustments without the need to see the horizon. With time and experience, helmsmen developed a kind of muscle memory that helped them respond automatically to changes in sea conditions. This skill was taught through practice, often starting when sailors were still young. Less experienced crew members began by observing and performing simple duties. Over time, they were allowed to take the helm under supervision. The sagas often refer to skilled helmsmen, but not in terms of navigation by stars or charts. Instead, they are praised for their ability to hold course or keep the ship straight. These phrases suggest a cultural respect for steering based on touch and reaction rather than calculations. Steering was seen as a learned craft, requiring attention, repetition, and familiarity with the ship. Viking ships were also shaped in ways that worked with the helmsman's role. Because the steering oar was always on the right side, hulls were often slightly asymmetrical. This introduced a directional bias that the helmsman would have to manage. During the reconstruction and testing of the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, replica of the Skoldelov, to ship from Roskilde Fjord, sailors confirmed how responsive these vessels were. Small changes in the tiller's pressure could alter the ship's heading, making it easy to steer but also requiring constant focus. Other sensors also played a role. Viking ships were built using clinker construction, with overlapping planks that made a distinctive sound in the water. Sailors became familiar with these sounds and could recognize differences caused by waves, shoals, or changing current. The pitch and roll of the ship, the pull of the wind, and the sound of water along the hull were all part of how the helmsman stayed oriented. These were not written rules, but part of everyday experience. Written records from the Viking Age do not describe mechanical tools for navigation. No magnetic compasses have been found at Viking sites. Documents like the Vita Anskari, written in the late 9th century, mention sailing and storms but do not refer to instruments. Navigation was done through observation, skill, and shared knowledge, not through devices or charts. On long voyages, the helmsman's task required stamina. A trip from Norway to the Orkney Islands, about 650 kilometers, could take several days. The helmsman worked closely with the seglermor, or sailmaster, to adjust for wind and maintain direction. Any shift in wind required fast response at the helm to keep the course steady. Steering was not something easily delegated. While rowing crews rotated shifts, helming demanded experience and was rarely handed off during complex parts of a journey. In calmer waters, an apprentice might take over under supervision, but in open sea or during bad weather, the main helmsman stayed in control. His understanding of the ship's behavior and sea patterns was critical to staying on course. In Egil's saga, compiled in the 13th century, the character RLF is noted for his ability to steer ships true through all waters. Though the account is stylized, it reflects a real value placed on skill at the helm. The helmsman's role combined physical coordination, memory, and environmental awareness, forming one of the most essential parts of Viking navigation, or rhythm and timekeeping. Internal clocks on open water. Time aboard a Viking ship was measured not by clocks or instruments, but by rhythm, repetition, and observation. Norse sailors used rowing strokes, shifts in environmental patterns, and routine tasks to estimate the passage of time. While not precise, this internal timekeeping was consistent and effective for the kind of navigation used during the Viking Age. It helped maintain heading, reduce fatigue, estimate distance, and structure daily duties during short trips or extended voyages. Rowing was central to this system. Although Viking ships, such as the Gokstad and Oseberg vessels, were equipped with sails, oars remained essential in certain conditions, especially in narrow fjords, harbors, or when wind was weak or inconsistent. The Gokstad ship, discovered in 1880 and dated to around 890 CE, had 16 pairs of oar holes, suggesting a coordinated rowing crew. Each rowing stroke acted as a unit of time. Repeated strokes across known distances gave rowers and helmsmen a way to estimate progress without external markers. Since mechanical devices like hourglasses or sundials were not used on ships, Viking crews relied on rhythm and pattern. A row master, typically positioned toward the middle of the vessel, might chant or beat time to keep strokes synchronized. A set rowing rhythm helped gauge how far a ship had traveled over time. For example, if a familiar island usually appeared after 2 hours of rowing and it did not come into view, the crew might suspect strong currents or a wrong heading. Shifts also played a role in timekeeping. Crews were rotated to avoid exhaustion, especially on longer voyages. A rowing shift might last 2 to 4 hours, depending on the number of crew and weather conditions. This rotation formed a routine structure of work and rest. While one group rowed or adjusted sails, another group rested. Night watches followed a similar pattern, helping the ship remain on course even in darkness or poor weather. The law code, compiled in Iceland in the 12th century and based on earlier traditions, mentions the need for men to stay alert on voyages. Though it does not detail exact timing, the reference suggests that structured watches and routines were common even without tools to mark the hour. These shifts created a shared understanding of time among the crew and allowed them to coordinate efforts during sailing, anchoring, or approaching land. Environmental awareness further supported this internal sense of time. In the summer, extended daylight in northern latitudes allowed sailors to estimate time by observing the sun's angle. For instance, if the sun was low and to port during a westward sail, the crew could identify it as late afternoon. In winter, or overcast conditions, when visual cues were limited, the ship's movement and wave patterns became more important. Tidal shifts, which in the Skagerrak Strait occurred about every 6 hours, were another natural indicator used to plan departures and monitor progress. Crews also listened for changes in sea sounds. The rhythm of water against the hull or the approach of surf could help identify distance from land or shifts in current. These clues, combined with rowing rhythm and watch rotations, gave the crew a multisensory way to keep track of time. Over time, these methods became second nature, though few Viking Age records survive. Later, Scandinavian sources reflect these practices. The King's Mirror, Konang Skugsya, written in Norway around 1250, offers insight into how seafarers understood time and direction. It emphasizes awareness of natural signs, wind, waves, and sunlight rather than tools. While it postdates the Viking Age, it likely draws from older oral knowledge. Life on board followed these natural rhythms. Tasks like checking, rigging, eating, or bailing water were done at expected intervals. Meals often coincided with rowing, shifts or sail changes. In the absence of mechanical devices, the human body helped structure time. Fatigue, hunger, and repetition all signaled when to rest, eat, or rotate duties. This physical routine supported long-distance navigation and made voyages more predictable. Modern voyages have helped test these ideas. In 2007, the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, a reconstruction of a 1042 CE Viking ship, sailed from Roskilde, Denmark, to Dublin, Ireland. Crew members reported that their awareness of time gradually shifted. Rather than relying on modern watches, they began to use rowing patterns, wind changes, and natural light to understand how much time had passed. This experience mirrors how Viking sailors likely managed time through habit, coordination, and observation. The mental map, oral transmission of nautical knowledge. Viking navigation did not depend on written maps or formal instructions. Instead, it relied on oral transmission and repeated practice. What modern researchers refer to as mental maps were detailed understandings of routes, landmarks, tides, and sea conditions, memorized by those who sailed. These internal maps were built over years of experience and transferred verbally from one generation to the next. They provided a reliable system of navigation across the North Atlantic, the Baltic, and the North Sea. In Norse society, writing was limited in scope. Runes were primarily used for short inscriptions, often memorial or ceremonial. There is no evidence of navigational texts or diagrams from the Viking Age, Yet archaeological and historical records show that Norse sailors regularly traveled between distant locations, such as from Norway to Iceland or from Denmark to Ireland. These successful journeys suggest that knowledge of sea routes was maintained in the minds of helmsmen and experienced crew. Learning these routes began early. Young sailors started as assistants, observing more experienced seafarers and gradually participating in navigation. As they traveled repeatedly along specific routes, they memorized key reference points such as islands, bays, headlands, and changes in sea behavior. They learned to identify the shape of distant mountains, the timing of tidal currents, and the direction of prevailing winds. The result was a navigational method rooted in memory and reinforced through oral teaching. The Landmobok, a 12th Icelandic book of settlements, includes details about voyages made in the 9th and 10th centuries. Although compiled later, it preserves older oral knowledge and refers to recognizable landmarks used during sea travel. These include bays like Faxaflói and Breiðafjörður, as well as nearby mountains and coastal features. Early settlers such as Ingólfur Arnarsson, believed to have reached Iceland around 874 CE, likely followed such orally described routes. Instruction was practical and specific. A helmsman might describe a route step by step: sail past 2 headlands, stay close to the shore until the cliffs appear, then turn when a flat-topped hill becomes visible. These spoken sequences functioned like verbal charts. They required careful observation and repetition, often reinforced during voyages when conditions matched what had been described in different regions. These mental maps adapted to local geography. In the Swedish archipelagos, sailors remembered narrow channels between rocks and the appearance of submerged reefs. In places like the Faroes or western Scotland, mental routes included safe harbors in case of storms. Even on open sea crossings, cues such as seabird presence, floating driftwood, and wave patterns were noted and incorporated into these internal maps. Archaeological findings from trading centers like Ideby and Kopang support the idea of regular long-distance sailing. These sites, active from the late 8th to 11th centuries, show evidence of imported goods and tools linked to extensive sea travel. Yet no charts or written logs have been uncovered. The reliability of these journeys points to memory-based navigation. As a stable and shared system among crews, verbal repetition was sometimes ritualized before major voyages. Crews might review the expected route together, reciting known features and potential hazards. This practice ensured that more than one person could recognize key landmarks or respond to changing conditions. If a helmsman became ill or incapacitated, another crew member could assume navigation duties using the same mental framework. Some elements of this memory culture appear in Icelandic legal codes. The GRGs, compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries, includes clauses about sharing knowledge of safe harbors and dangerous areas. While not explicit about how such knowledge was passed on, its inclusion in law reflects the expectation that navigational information was a community resource, not private property. There is also indirect support in skaldic verse, which sometimes mentions direction, distance, or landmarks. Though not technical, these references show that sea travel and spatial awareness were part of cultural memory. The emphasis was not on calculating positions, but on recognizing the signs of the journey and remembering how to respond. Continuity of routes across generations can be seen in places like York and Dublin, where Scandinavian goods and building styles remained consistent over time. This stability suggests that internal knowledge systems were accurate enough to support regular travel, trade, and communication, despite the lack of physical records. For the Vikings, navigation was not about instruments or drawings. It was about what the helmsman knew, what the crew remembered, and what the sea revealed. From Iceland to Vinland, the role of migratory birds and seasonal paths, the Norse expansion into the North Atlantic, depended on careful observation of nature, particularly patterns that repeated each year. Among the most consistent and visible were migratory birds. Viking sailors paid attention to the flight paths of seabirds, using them as directional cues during open water voyages. These birds became especially important on westward journeys from Iceland to Greenland and later to North America. Without compasses or maps, the Norse relied on environmental signs, and birds provided movement across the sky that often pointed to land. Permanent Norse settlement in Iceland began around 874 CE. According to the Landnobak, a medieval record of early colonists, by the late 10th century, voyages extended westward to Greenland, led by Eric the Red after his exile from Iceland. The journey from Iceland to Greenland was approximately 1,200 kilometers across ocean with few visible landmarks. Bird behavior helped fill this navigational gap. Species such as the northern fulmar, Arctic tern, and puffin were commonly seen in these waters. Fulmars tend to remain near land during breeding season and fly between feeding zones and nesting. Cliffs, if spotted flying in a consistent direction during morning or evening, they could indicate the presence of land. Puffins and terns also offered navigational value, particularly when seen flying low and directly toward the horizon, behavior often linked to movement between nesting sites and feeding grounds. Observations like these allowed sailors to infer proximity to land, often within a day's sail. Norse sagas support this practice. In the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, crews are described releasing birds to help find land. One early sailor, Floki Vilga Arson, reportedly brought 3 ravens to guide his route. 1 raven returned to the ship, 1 flew upward and circled back, and 1 flew straight ahead and disappeared. Floki interpreted the last bird's behavior as a sign that land lay in that direction. While the saga was written down later and may include embellishment, it reflects a broader understanding of using animal behavior as navigational input. Seasonal timing was essential. Voyages typically left between late May and early August. Summer in the North Atlantic offered longer daylight, calmer seas, and predictable bird migrations. Crews often used the visible behavior of birds, along with sea state and wind direction, to decide departure windows. Once at sea, they used the direction of bird flights to adjust course or verify their heading. The Greenland settlements, established around 985 CE, served as the next major base for westward exploration. From there, Norse ships traveled even farther, reaching North America by approximately 1000 CE. The site at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, dated through radiocarbon analysis, matches descriptions in the Vinland sagas. The route to this region crossed at least 2,500 kilometers of ocean and coastal water. Seabirds flying south during late summer migrations were among the few directional signs available on these long passages. When spotted flying in tight formation, or low over the water, they helped indicate general orientation, especially when traveling along the Labrador coast or through the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Alongside birds, other natural indicators such as floating driftwood and the presence of whales helped with orientation. However, birds were often more reliable because they could be seen from a greater distance and in a wider range of conditions. Crews noted the presence, direction, and behavior of birds and shared this information orally. A crew member might remember seeing fulmars appearing off the port side on the second day of a previous journey, or that terns had flown ahead just before landfall. These observations became part of the collective knowledge passed from one voyage to the next. Comparable traditions exist in other cultures. Pacific Island navigators, including those in Polynesia, also used birds as navigation tools, especially near land. While Norse seafaring developed independently in colder climates, the shared reliance on bird behavior across oceanic cultures supports the effectiveness of the method. The use of birds as navigational aids decreased as maritime tools improved. With the development of compasses and charts in later centuries, reliance on environmental cues declined. But during the 10th and 11th centuries, birds remained a critical component of Viking navigation. Their visible movement and seasonal reliability helped guide Norse ships beyond familiar coasts, expanding their reach across the Atlantic. Flotsam, drift ice, and seaweed, floating clues to landfall. Viking navigation in the North Atlantic depended on observing natural signs rather than using instruments or maps. Among the most useful indicators were floating materials, driftwood, seaweed, and drift ice. These objects provided clues about proximity to land, the strength and direction of currents, and potential hazards. Between the late 9th and early 11th centuries, Norse sailors regularly crossed long distances between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of North America, relying on experience and observation. Driftwood held practical and navigational value. In places like Greenland, where trees were scarce, it became a necessary resource. Eric the Red and his followers, who established settlements in Greenland around 985 CE, depended on driftwood for construction and repairs. This would arrive via the East Greenland Current, which carried it from Arctic Norway or even Siberia. When Viking sailors encountered driftwood at sea or along unfamiliar coasts, it often confirmed they were approaching land. Its size, types such as spruce or pine and condition gave sailors further clues about how recently it had been carried by the current and how close they might be to shore. Seaweed also served as a navigational aid. Species like black and knotted wrack grow in shallow coastal waters. When seen floating far from land, they usually indicated that land was nearby. The freshness of the seaweed helped sailors judge distance. Wet green seaweed suggested it had come from a nearby shoreline and had not spent long in open water. If dry or discolored, it might have traveled farther, and land might still be some distance away. These clues appear in several saga texts, including Lander Mobach and the Saga of the Greenlanders. In these stories, characters sometimes recognize driftwood or seaweed as signs that land is near, although the references are part of narrative scenes rather than formal instructions. They reflect how familiar and reliable these materials were. Two Norse sailors. They were not treated as exceptional discoveries, but as part of the expected experience of sea travel. Drift ice, while potentially dangerous, was another predictable feature of the North Atlantic environment. The East Greenland Current often brought ice south from the Arctic, especially in late spring and early summer. Norse ships sailing from Iceland to Greenland expected to encounter ice as they neared Greenland's coast. While they avoided direct contact with ice floes, sailors could use their appearance to confirm that Greenland was nearby. Navigators often adjusted course, following the ice edge before turning inward toward more protected waters in Greenland's southern fjords. The Saga of Eric Red. The Red includes references to ice during voyages, particularly between Iceland and Greenland. These details are not always emphasized but are presented as routine parts of the crossing. Ice signaled not only danger but also direction. In this case, observation of ice behavior helped supplement other clues, like bird flight and driftwood. Seaweed had additional uses near land. Viking sailors employed sounding lines to measure depth and identify the sea bottom. These were ropes with weighted ends, often coated with grease. When pulled back to the surface, the grease would sometimes carry sand, gravel, or seaweed. If seaweed appeared, it typically meant the bottom was rocky or vegetated, characteristics of shallower nearshore environments. Though Viking Age sounding lines have not survived, similar tools were used in later Norse navigation, and their method is supported by findings from harbor sites such as Hiddeby and Roskilde. Seasonal timing affected how flotsam was interpreted. The arrival of new driftwood in spring indicated the Arctic melt had begun. The presence of seaweed after storms suggested recent disturbances along the seafloor. Icebergs on the horizon in summer or fall pointed to shifts in currents. These seasonal observations, learned through repetition, gave experienced sailors a way to interpret not just direction, but also timing and environmental change. Modern studies confirm the logic of these Viking-era practices. Driftwood from Siberia does reach Greenland's shores. Seaweed travels along predictable tidal paths. The movement of Arctic ice is seasonal and can be tracked. Viking sailors, without formal measurement tools, identified these same patterns. Through trial and observation, for Norse crews navigating long stretches of open water, any change on the sea's surface mattered. A clump of seaweed or a length of driftwood could confirm they were on course. In a time before charts or compasses, these floating materials became essential tools in an observational system that combined memory, habit, and a detailed understanding of natural processes. Smoke on the horizon, recognizing human settlement from afar. During the Viking Age, recognizing signs of human activity from the sea could shape the outcome of a voyage. One of the most visible signs of settlement was smoke. Even before the land itself came into view, a thin column rising from the horizon could signal farms, camps, or towns. For Norse sailors navigating between the 9th and 11th centuries, especially during exploratory or trading voyages, smoke served as one of the earliest and most reliable indicators of human presence. Fire was essential to everyday life in Norse households. Cooking, heating, and metalworking required constant flames. In colder months, longhouses often maintained indoor fires throughout the day. Larger sites, such as trading stations or communal halls, used multiple hearths. As a result, smoke, was common and often visible from afar, especially on still days or during early morning hours. In areas where fog, terrain, or weather hid the coastline, smoke could stand out clearly against the sky. The sagas reflect this. In the saga of the Greenlanders, Norse explorers such as Leif Erikson and Karl Sifny reported seeing smoke before approaching new coasts. These accounts suggest that smoke was understood as a marker of habitation. Whether the sight meant welcome, risk, or opportunity depended on the circumstances, but it almost always meant people were nearby. Geography influenced how visible smoke could be. Along flat coasts in Denmark or Sweden, fires behind trees or low hills were often hidden. Their smoke drifted upward. In Norway, many settlements were built in inlets or valleys. These areas might not be visible from offshore, but their smoke traveled over cliffs and forests, giving away their location. Since most coastal settlements faced the water for fishing and trade, sailors commonly saw smoke before seeing structures. On longer voyages, smoke had additional meaning. For those reaching Iceland, Greenland, or Vinland, smoke could reveal whether an area was already claimed or occupied. In Iceland, settled around 874 CE, new arrivals searched for empty land. A plume of smoke suggested someone had arrived before them. In Greenland, colonized around 985 CE, seeing smoke could indicate a nearby farmstead or camp. It could also help locate known settlements when visibility was poor. In some cases, ships changed course to avoid smoke. In others, it was a welcome guide. The usefulness of smoke depended on whether wind could disperse it. Rain could make it hard to see, but in calm conditions or under long summer twilight skies, even a faint line was visible for kilometers. Studies suggest that during the medieval warm period, which lasted from about 950 to 1250 CE, weather patterns in the North Atlantic may have favored more predictable sailing and clearer skies, making smoke easier to see. Excavations at Viking sites confirm that smoke would have been constant. At Borg in Lofoten, a large longhouse dating to the late 9th century had signs of sustained hearth use. Similar evidence appears at Gokstad and Jorvik, where fires served both domestic and industrial purposes. In Jorvik, tanning, blacksmithing, and cooking all produced smoke, making the town more visible from the sea. While not every fire produced a large plume, the combined effect across many households would have been noticeable. Smoke was not always a neutral sign. During times of war or raiding, it could signal damage. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records villages burning during Viking raids. For an approaching ship, smoke might mean destruction or defense. It could also indicate a recent attack or serve as a warning to others. Crews had to interpret smoke carefully, whether it marked a safe harbor, a threat, or the aftermath of violence. Viking longships had the advantage of flexibility. Their shallow draft and speed let them approach quietly or turn away quickly. Spotting smoke in advance gave time to make decisions. Unlike currents or birds, which guided navigation, smoke directly indicated human presence. This made it one of the few natural signs that linked seafaring with social or tactical outcomes. Later, Norse texts suggest that smoke was also used intentionally. Though there was no formal system, smoke signals or beacon fires were used to alert nearby communities. The Heimskringla, written in the 13th century, describes fire used to warn of ships. In remote places, a single thin plume could guide lost sailors or confirm a safe return home. Trial voyages and wayfinding rituals, how routes were tested and remembered. Before the sea routes between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland became established, they were first tested through trial voyages. These journeys, often led by experienced Norse helmsmen in the 9th to 11th centuries, were not random explorations, but carefully planned ventures into unfamiliar waters. Through repeated efforts, navigators identified useful seasonal windows, tested prevailing winds and currents, and observed environmental signs that marked key transitions during long sea crossings. What began as tentative experiments evolved into reliable passages that connected distant coasts. One of the earliest recorded cases of a westward voyage was that of Nadad, a Norse sailor who reportedly discovered Iceland around 850 CE after being blown off course en route to the Faroe Islands. According to later sources like the land Nobak, he named the snow-covered land Snyland or Snowland, but did not stay. Garhas Farvason, arriving shortly after, sailed around the island and confirmed it was separate from the mainland. These initial expeditions triggered further interest and became the foundation for later settlement. Crews selected specific times of year, typically late spring to midsummer, to test new sea routes. Conditions were more stable during this period, and the longer daylight allowed crews to observe subtle changes in the sea, sky, and surrounding wildlife. The focus of these voyages was not only to reach land, but also to note patterns. When birds appeared, what floating material drifted by, how long each leg of the journey lasted, and which directions provided the most favorable currents or wind. Every observation added detail to what would become shared knowledge passed on through spoken instructions. By the late 10th century, these early tests had become the basis for repeatable crossings. Eric the Red's voyage to Greenland around 982 CE illustrates this pattern. Exiled from Iceland, he sailed west and explored Greenland's fjords during a 3-year banishment. Upon returning, he encouraged others to join him by calling the land Greenland, a deliberate name to attract settlers. Around 985 CE, 25 ships set out from Iceland. Only 14 completed the voyage, highlighting how uncertain these journeys remained. Even once the route was known. To preserve what was learned, Norse mariners relied heavily on oral tradition. Directions were encoded in spoken memory, often framed in simple, repeatable phrases. Instructions like sail west until the birds veer south, or wait for driftwood before turning toward land, made sense to experienced crews who had observed these phenomena firsthand. Younger crew members learned by sailing under veterans, memorizing patterns and timing rather than relying on written notes or maps. Rituals reinforced the importance of these voyages. Before sailing, some crews made offerings to Ingjord, the sea god, or to ancestral spirits believed to offer protection. Archaeological finds from sites in coastal Norway and central Sweden show evidence of animal sacrifice and symbolic artifacts linked to seafaring. These rites were intended to secure safe passage or express thanks for a successful return. They also helped embed root knowledge within a cultural framework that extended beyond individual memory, naming places after specific events or individuals further anchored roots into shared knowledge. After Floki, Vilga Arsen's voyage to Iceland, the fjord where he released ravens to find land was remembered. So was the site of his winter hardships later, known as Vatn. Each named location helped retain the route in communal memory, especially when used in storytelling or passed along to future navigators. Nearshore sailing was also used to build confidence before venturing into open ocean. In areas like Western Norway or the Northern Isles of Scotland, ships hugged coastlines and tested small route segments before attempting larger crossings. These shorter passages gave mariners a chance to observe sea behavior and adjust the vessel or crew accordingly. Once deemed reliable, these segments became stepping stones in the longer routes between major destinations. The Norse approach to trial voyages was cumulative. Each successful crossing built upon earlier efforts, and each failed attempt offered warnings to be remembered. By the time voyages to Vinland were attempted around 1000 CE, Norse navigators had developed a system of environmental reading, seasonal planning, and oral transmission that supported long-distance travel. Without charts or instruments, they used lived experience to map the sea, one journey at a time. The role of the steersman, authority, and precision in Viking crews. In Viking maritime culture, the steersman held a role of significant authority, known as the strymer in Old Norse. This individual was more than someone who guided the ship's direction. He was responsible for reading the sea, choosing routes, and making decisions that could determine the success or failure of a voyage. Whether navigating the coasts of Norway or crossing the open North Atlantic, the steersman's experience and judgment were vital. The steering oar, mounted on the right side of the stern, required both strength and technique to operate. Positioned at the back of the ship, the steersman adjusted course constantly, using cues from wind, waves, and visible landmarks. But his duties extended far beyond physical steering. He interpreted sky conditions, tracked the flight of birds, watched for flotsam, and evaluated changing tides and currents. These observations formed the basis for critical decisions, such as when to sail or hold position. The design of Viking ships reflected the steersman's importance. The Gokstad ship, uncovered in 1880 in a burial mound in Vestfold, Norway, and dated to around 890 CE, shows reinforced stern construction. This design likely helped absorb the stress of steering through rough seas. The ship's planks and bracings suggest deliberate structural planning to accommodate the demands placed on the helmsman. Other vessels, such as the Oseberg ship, also demonstrate that the steersman's position was central to the ship's operation. In legal and social terms, the steersman carried weight as well. In GRGs, the medieval Icelandic law code compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries, the steersman is recognized as a legal authority during voyages. He was responsible for navigational choices and bore liability in case of error. While not always the shipowner or captain, the steersman's judgment was prioritized during travel. He was often an older, experienced individual whose skill and memory were widely respected. Before each sailing season, which typically began in mid-May, steersmen gathered at regional meetings or markets to exchange recent observations at things such as the Althing in Iceland or smaller assemblies along the Norwegian coast. Sailors shared updates on shifting sandbars, new hazards, or changes in current patterns. The steersman would incorporate this information into his mental map, which shaped upcoming voyages. For long-distance crossings where landmarks were scarce, the steersman relied on sensory input. The sound of waves striking the hull, the angle of the sun, and the direction of wind gusts all provided navigational feedback. In sagas like the Land Nimbark, early settlers in Iceland credited successful journeys to the wisdom of the steersman, a phrase repeated in later texts, underlining the weight placed on this role. The image of the steersman appears in Norse literature as a metaphor for leadership. In political writings, rulers were sometimes described as helmsmen of society. The connection between guiding a ship and guiding a people suggests the cultural respect for this maritime role. Being a steersman was not only a matter of physical skill but of judgment, memory, and the ability to inspire confidence in one's crew. Communication between the steersman and the rest of the crew was essential, particularly with the lookout and rowers. Commands were often given through gestures or subtle timing rather than speech. During sudden storms or strong coastal winds, the steersman had to respond quickly. A delayed adjustment could lead to capsizing or water intake. Successful handling of such events elevated a steersman's reputation, while shipwrecks were sometimes attributed to poor steering decisions. Although no personal writings from Viking steersmen survive, many sagas reference them. In the saga of the Greenlanders, the ship that carried Leif Erikson is noted to have an able man at the rudder. In Egil's saga, a skilled steersman avoids reefs near Shetland, helping the crew survive treacherous conditions. These mentions highlight the essential role steersmen played in Norse exploration and trade. Training future steersmen followed an oral and experiential model. Sons or apprentices would join voyages and gradually assume tasks under supervision. They began by handling the steering or in mild conditions and learning to recognize coastal features. Over time, they developed the physical and mental instincts needed to manage a ship's movement and interpret environmental clues through repetition and memory. This knowledge passed from one generation to the next without written charts. The steersman's role, built on lived experience, formed one of the most important pillars of Viking maritime success. Storm, navigation, and shelter, seeking safety without landmarks. Viking ships were designed for adaptability and speed, but their success also relied on surviving sudden storms in open water. Without modern instruments or fixed landmarks, Norse crews needed to read the sea and sky with precision. From the 9th to 11th centuries, storms posed one of the greatest threats to maritime travel. Wind shifts, dense fog, and unpredictable squalls could scatter fleets, capsize ships, or drive them far off course. The methods used to navigate through storms were a vital part of Viking seafaring knowledge, passed through experience rather than written records. The North Sea posed particular challenges. Its shallows, sandbanks, and strong currents made it hazardous even in calm conditions. Ships sailing from Denmark to Frisia, or from Norway to the British Isles, often encountered sudden changes in wind direction and visibility. Longships built for flexibility had shallow hulls that allowed for quick turns and beach landings, but this also made them less stable in rough, open water. A heavy load of cargo or people made them more susceptible to capsizing if the crew couldn't quickly adapt to changing conditions. One of the best-known storm incidents occurred during Harald Hardrada's 1066 expedition to England. Chroniclers, including Snorri Sturluson in Heimskringla, Note that his fleet was disrupted by a storm near the English coast. While not every ship was lost, the delay and confusion contributed to his army's vulnerability at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This event, though primarily military in focus, demonstrates how dependent even large fleets were on favorable conditions and how weather could affect broader outcomes. To avoid or prepare for storms, Viking crews observed the environment closely. Darkening clouds, changes in wind pressure, and the sudden disappearance of seabirds were seen as warnings. The feel of moisture in the air, shifts in wave behavior, or the sound of distant thunder gave additional clues. Sagas like Egil's saga mention sailors watching the sky for signs of danger, suggesting that such practices were common knowledge among crews. When storms appeared likely, the first priority was to seek shelter. In coastal Norway, fjords offered natural protection. Deep inlets, with high cliffs that blocked strong winds and waves. Ships would steer into these channels, drop anchor, or be pulled ashore. In Iceland or the northern British Isles, sailors looked for sheltered coves or beaches with gentle slopes. Knowledge of these safe zones was memorized by experienced helmsmen and passed orally to younger generations. Archaeological research supports this. At Heilmarvik, on Iceland's east coast, evidence of repeated landings shows that certain beaches were used regularly as storm shelters. Stone arrangements helped brace vessels, and erosion patterns suggest ships were hauled out of the surf during rough weather. These sites weren't random, they were chosen for protection and accessibility during emergencies. If no shelter was near, the crew adapted while at sea. The first step was usually to reef the sail. Viking sails were made of wool and could become dangerous in strong gusts. Rolling down part of the sail reduced surface area and made steering easier. If the wind became too strong, the sail was taken down completely, and oars were used instead. Oars, usually for harbor navigation, became essential tools for staying in place or changing direction in high seas. Adjusting ballast also helped. Viking ships normally sat high in the water, but extra weight stones, cargo, or water barrels could stabilize the vessel during storms. The crew could shift this ballast to balance the ship, especially if waves came from one direction. Ships carrying livestock or trade goods required special care, as the load could move unexpectedly. At night or during heavy fog, navigation relied on feel. Without stars or shoreline, steersmen paid attention to how the ship moved, how it rocked, how the rudder pulled, and how the waves hit the hull. Experienced helmsmen could detect drift and adjust their heading by making small changes to the rudder or signaling rowers to correct course. These adjustments were often made silently, based on shared practice and rhythm. Ships carried tools for basic repairs. Spare rope, wooden planks, nails, and tar or resin were used to fix leaks or reinforce weak spots. Archaeological finds at Hiddeby and Rib include repair tools and sealing materials, confirming that maintenance was a planned part of long voyages. Quick repairs at sea could make the difference between survival and disaster. Returning home, memory, scent, and the familiar shape of the sea. For Viking crews returning from long voyages, whether from the British Isles, Iceland, or the Baltic, the final phase of the journey relied less on tools and more on memory. Without maps or written records, sailors depended on recognizing coastlines, wind shifts, and the behavior of birds. These sensory cues, built through repeated travel, guided them home even when land was not yet visible. In western Norway, fjords served as natural funnels toward ports like Bergen and Trondheim. Crews identified specific ridgelines, peaks, and headlands. Landmarks like Sukatoppen near Lesand or the mountains of Smulla became embedded in navigators' memories. Even the way sound echoed off cliffs helped confirm location in fog or poor light. These auditory signals were passed down through oral instruction and observation on earlier voyages. The scent of land was another clue. In sagas such as the saga of the people of Laxador, sailors note recognizing home by the smell of peat fires, moss, or wet earth carried on the wind. Although written centuries later, these references reflect earlier practices. A shift in air temperature or a faint earthy scent often preceded visual confirmation of land. Combined with the color of the sea or floating debris, this gave experienced helmsmen strong indications that they were nearing familiar shores. Iceland presented different challenges. The coastline is lower and flatter, offering fewer dramatic landmarks. Instead, sailors returning to places like Reykjavik or Borgarfjörður looked for major features such as Mount Esja or Stenfels. These glacial peaks stood out against the horizon and were used to guide ships coming from Greenland or the Hebrides. Around 930 CE, settlers returning to Iceland depended on clear skies during the last stretch, as fog could obscure these key markers and delay landfall. In Denmark, the approach was complicated by tidal flats and low-lying coastal zones. Ships returning to Hiddeby or Rib had to identify subtle natural changes, sandbars, eelgrass beds, and shifting currents. Wooden poles and rock cairns placed along the coast helped guide vessels. Excavations at Hiddeby reveal structured harbor entrances and arrangements of stones, indicating that controlled entry into ports was practiced as early as the 9th century. Seasonal conditions changed how the coastline looked and felt. A harbor in spring, swollen with meltwater, might sound different or have more floating debris than in autumn. Experienced crews adjusted expectations depending on the time of year. In areas like the Faroe Islands or eastern Iceland, poor visibility and bad weather often meant waiting offshore for safe conditions before attempting to enter bays or inlets. Final approach routines were often verbalized. The helmsman might recite expected signs, a headland on the left, a shift in current, or the moment birds reappeared near land. This verbal repetition reinforced memory and allowed younger crew to learn through exposure. These informal teachings helped preserve navigational traditions across generations without needing maps or diagrams. In the Orkney and Shetland, islands settled by Norse seafarers, by the 9th century navigation involved both natural and artificial markers. Stone cairns and signal poles were erected to help identify harbor entrances. Archaeological evidence suggests these markers were used not only for ceremony, but also for practical guidance. Crews approaching in poor weather could use these fixed points to avoid dangerous reefs or shoals. Scandinavian folklore from later centuries suggests that some Viking sailors carried small objects from homestones, pieces of turf, or wood. Though evidence is limited, these items likely had symbolic meaning, helping to maintain a sense of orientation and connection to home. Their presence in oral traditions indicates that memory was not only functional, but also emotional.